Thank you so much, Fabienne and Professor Bernard for presenting us. So we're extremely happy to be here. We've been here for a few days now, so we're had the opportunity to have a great time with some of you. And so we're going to present the book that will be published in about 2 weeks. We worked about the last year. We worked on the book, especially the last months, quite intensively to finish it. It's done. We're happy. So we're not going to try to be too long on our talk, because I think for us that we share this common interest on the topic. I think we really should have a conversation. Although, of course, we'll say the basics about the book, and then we can have a discussion about. So the main motivation for us, so Catarina, as well as me, we're not only researchers, we're mainly researchers, but in Portugal we also advocate for basic income. We have a basic income association in Portugal, and so we write many articles in the main newspapers to try to defend basic income. So we're very engaged. And we also engage with some people who have a project of implementing a basic income experiment in south of Portugal, in Alentejo, Alcácer do Sal, a small town with a communist mayor, actually. So it's curious, who is interested in eventually implementing an experiment. So for us, it's not only about theory. It is about theory, of course, but it's also about how to find ways in our country to implement a basic income experiment at least, and then eventually a national implementation of the idea. And this book is a result of that motivation. As theoretical inspiration, I would say that Karl Wiedeke's book on basic income experiments, which we published a couple years ago, and with Catarina we also published this year a symposium on his book. I think that's the best book, full book on, the epistemological issues surrounding basic income experiments. But our strategy was different, so it's not so abstract as Karl's book is. We wanted to start by interviewing many stakeholders implied in about 15 experiments, and from there try to find what they have in common and what are their main differences. So the objective is quite humble. We're not trying to have a grand theory about basic income experiments. We mainly wish to give some highlights to the main differences between them and the main points in common. So this is our agenda for our presentation, the goal of the book, the methodology. We had some case studies. We interviewed about 18 people. And then I'll give you a quick outline of the book, and then Catarina will talk about the main parts of the book. The book is divided in 3 parts. First part is about what we have learned about the experiments, the interviews we made, and then the new questions that arose after those interviews, and finally we come up with some answers for these questions. And the final thing is, should we really conduct more basic income experiments? There have been so many experiments already. We have a lot of information already. Perhaps we should advocate, not lose so much energy on advocating for basic income experiments, but advocate for national implementation, for example. This is things that we can discuss about afterwards, after our presentation. So, as I just said, why should we have basic income experiments? There are many. There have been many since the 60s, the 70s of the 20th century. Now, Catarina told me yesterday that in the US, there are already 100 basic income experiments going on. So it's an explosion of experiments. And what we want to know is, do they have any specific world that we can highlight and which can be useful for us to understand? So first, there are many common criticisms. If many of you might be also advocates of basic income, so as you probably know, many basic income advocates are against experiments for the reason I just told you. It's a waste of time. Even if we have experiments, most of the experiments, when you look at the results, of course they are positive in almost every direction that we look at. But still, even with very positive results, it's obvious that politically it will be very difficult to use it as an argument for a national implementation. So, and not the least, because in any society, I mean, there are people intrinsically against the idea of a basic income, even if the results are good, even if people work more happily and work more with a basic income than without a basic income, etc., because some people are against it for very deep ethical reasons. You know, think about Marxists, about communists. Usually work is very important for having a good life, a dignified life, and if you don't work, well, you cannot be a full citizen, for example. So we cannot be over-optimistic, even if we have a very good basic income experiment in Germany in the next years, the results are perfect, there will always be ideological opposition, and for very well-grounded reasons. I mean, the debate in theory is still a very, the arguments against basic income on ethical grounds are very strong arguments, very difficult to refute, maybe impossible to refute, actually. So this is, we can expect that many people will still be against basic income. Another criticism that we can find amongst advocates who are against basic income experiments but are for the idea of UBI is that when we do a specific experiment, of course we have to choose a specific model. You know, who's going to get the money, how many, what will be the quantity of the basic income, etc. So many people will say, okay, this basic income experiment does not correspond to our ideal of a basic income, so we should not have it, because why test things that do not correspond to what the ideal of a basic income is? So even if we agree on the definition of a basic income, and in the world we more or less all of us agreed about what is a basic income, at least theoretically, there's not a very hard discussion. We might have a discussion about the rhetorics of basic income, but not the essential definition. And some people also think that we should not have experiments, because if we're going to fight and advocate for a basic income, we should just see it as a natural right, you know, and try to implement it, put it in the Constitution if necessary. So experiments, losing energy doing experiments is losing time for fighting for UBI as a right. So that would be another criticism. Perhaps some of you share this criticism, so it would be interesting to discuss about it. Well, even if there are many criticisms that can be formulated against basic income, of course there are also many advantages of having UBI experiments. In my case, for example, I want to have one in Portugal, because I know that if we have one, this will be like a soap opera. I mean, in the media news, everybody will start following it, and people will see what are the results. Maybe people still keep working. So for me, the main reason to advocate for basic income experiments is mainly because the public discussion will become much stronger, with a lot more, much more stimulating. So this is one of the advantages would be that not only the discussion would be much more stimulating, but also many prejudices against basic income, which are so easily formulated when we write papers in the newspapers. There's always a Marxist or a lucha liberal who will formulate a silly argument against basic income. So perhaps with the basic income experiments, the most silly arguments about basic income will become less audible. So the main advantages would be that. And of course, depending on the results of the experiment, if they're good or if they're bad, then we can have a further argument to implement at a national scale. So overall, the discussion is much richer. I mean, we have Otto here, it's true, from Finland, and it's true that the international mediatic spin of the Finnish experiment was a total disaster. I mean, when we read the international news, they say, okay, people don't stop working. So this is a big problem for us also, to try to spin the mediatic attention in a good direction. Thank you, Catarina. Again, you can see our book. It will be published in 2 weeks. So we wrote this, of course, with Catarina and with Brulain, who was a researcher at our center, and now he is back to Barcelona, where he also participated in the Barcelona experiment. The goal is very simple. We want to have, we wanted policy people, students, have access to a book which, builds on interviews with a lot of empirical information, with a common language about basic income experiments done all over the world. Actually, at the beginning, the idea we had was just to make a map of all the main experiments in the world. But then a friend of us, Juliana Bidadanu, who's the director of the UB Lab in Stanford University, did it before us. So we didn't know what to do, so we decided to write the book. But the general idea for us was to, try to connect all these people working in different experiments and help these people communicate between them. So our hope is that with this book, many of these persons involved in experiments and around this will read it and will find common things, and we can discuss about can exchange about what they're doing. So our methodology is very simple. We just interviewed quite a few people and involved in the recent past and in present and in future experiments, also planned experiments. So we try to provide an analysis of some of the major factors influencing experiments and some of the most important outputs. So our general question for the book is really, why should we have basic income experiments? Because there already have been so many experiments. But we think that we need to have still more information, more data, so we try to answer to those questions too. And there are many additional questions, such as what is the impact of the different motivations to conduct basic income experiments in the overall implementation. So these are questions that we also formulated while doing the interviews. We realized that we could think about these questions too. So what is the role of the political context when deciding to implement a basic income experiment throughout the project, but also in ensuring its future? Can we draw differences between research on UB experiments and research on basic income implemented as a policy in each context? How is the overall reception to basic income experiments from the different stakeholders? What are the main difficulties in conducting a basic income experiment and why? What are the main results taken from different basic income experiments, and what changes were most relevant according to the stakeholders involved in the research? And in what way do basic income experiments generally contribute to the basic income debate? So these are questions that we try to answer in the book. And again, our strategy was very simple. We could not interview everybody. I mean, we're just 3 researchers, so we had to limit the interviews. But the idea is to, from the interviews, try to formulate some recommendations. Okay. So who are the people we interviewed? In the case study of the basic income pilot in Finland, we interviewed Minna Ilikano, who was involved in the Finnish experiments. In the case of the Utrecht and the other towns related to the Utrecht experiment, we interviewed Roger van Loon and Timo Verlat. For the basic income experiment in Barcelona, we interviewed Luis Torrens, also very importantly involved in the Barcelona experiment. Regarding the Ontario's experiment, we interviewed Wayne Liuchuk. And regarding the experiment in Namibia, we interviewed Dick Hartman and his wife, Claudia, sorry. And regarding the Madhya Pradesh experiment, we interviewed Sarat Davala, who many of you also might know because he's the BIEN chair, Basic Income Network chair. And also regarding the seed experiment in the US, we interviewed Stasia West and Amy Castro, who are now the principal, who now direct a center in Pennsylvania University, where they are monitoring the dozens of experiments in the US. So this is really a very interesting center to be in contact with, because they have first-hand information on many experiments, and actually Catarina will work with them in a couple of months. And from the Kenya experiment, through the Give Directly ONG, we interviewed Caroline Tetti. Also, we interviewed from the experiment in Brazil, which is a very interesting experiment, very complete. We interviewed 2 people, Fabio Waltenberg and Fernando Freitas. So, from Macau, as you know, there's a basic income there, unconditional basic income called Wealth Partaking Scheme. We interviewed José Luís Salles Marques, who is a recipient of basic income as any person from Macau, but who was also involved in politics. He wasn't mayor.
He was mayor.
He was mayor, so he had first-hand information of. Yeah, he was mayor before Macau became.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Maybe when Macau was still Portuguese until 1995. So, from the eastern band of Cherokee Indians dividend, we interviewed Randall Aki, who is a researcher specialized in the results of this policy. As you know, in this eastern band, there is also an unconditional basic income, which has been going on for years now. Although there are not enough studies about it, there should be more studies about it. And then for the South Korea Youth Basic Income Project, we interviewed Hao Sang-an. I don't know if you're following a bit South Korean politics, but there's a very strong chance that the next South Korean Prime Minister might be the person who is advocating basic income now for years in South Korea. So this could be really a game changer. And finally, from the policy in Iran, we interviewed the researcher Javad Salehi Isfahani. And well, that was it. We had a great time. It was Zoom interviews during the COVID. And also we interviewed Jamie Cook from he is the head of the Royal Society for the Arts in Scotland, and he's very involved in trying to implement a basic income experiment in Scotland. Now for years, it hasn't been easy, but it seems that slowly they're going to get there. And finally, from Berlin, from the Berlin experiment, we interviewed Maheba Godekir-Tort, and I think that's the people we interviewed. So, about the case studies, of course, we choose their prominence in the basic income debate. We also chose them because there was enough data available, and also because these experiments are close to what we consider a pure basic income, that is at least unconditional, right? Unconditional, like in the sense of obligations free. In all these experiments or policies, it's obligations free, which is the heart of the basic income idea. They're also individual, although of course they are not universal in the sense that not everybody in the society receives it. So it's really exciting times for us. I mean, there are many more experiments today than there were in the 60s or the 70s. So there's a lot going on, and I hope we'll have many more books and articles about these experiments, and especially books who try to do a theory or to find common ground on all these experiments. So just to show you, this is the map done by Juliana Bidadanu at Stanford University, at the Basic Income Lab. So probably you've seen it before. So some of these, this is only the people we interview is only a small sample of all the experiments going on, but still quite representative. Okay, I'm going to change the micro to Catarina.
So thank you again for having me and for having Roberto. It's really a great pleasure to know some of you, to know the city of Freiburg, which is beautiful, and to discuss the topic with you. So as Roberto was saying, this was a huge project for 1 year, mostly also for the last couple of months, but a huge project to talk with so many different people from so many different case studies. And it would be great to present you all the case studies and discuss them in detail, but we don't have time. Maybe we can do it in the discussion afterwards. So I'm just going to try to present you some of the main findings, which are probably things that you already know in some way, others maybe not so much, that we got from the interviews, and then present you what we concluded, how we tried to answer many of the questions that we had in the book so that we can discuss it. So as Roberto was saying, the book is divided into introduction, which says mostly what Roberto was saying, but also has a more generous outline of each case study and of previous case studies, namely the ones that happened in the 60s and the 70s, because we didn't include them, but they were important to frame basic income experiments in general. And then it's divided in two main parts. The part one, where we try to present some of the key issues from the experiments and some of the key questions that usually everyone who engages in basic income experiments has to face. And then part two, where we try to talk about issues that have received some attention, but maybe not so much, but were salient from our interviews. And so we thought that they deserved more attention. So what were the things that we discussed on part one? We started out very excited. We're going to talk about basic income experiments. This is going to be easy. Everyone knows what basic income experiments. But as soon as we got it to talking with 18 people, we realized how kind of confusing basic income experiments as a general term can be. If you see the case studies that we had policies like what's happening in Brazil in the city of Maricá, which is a policy that was implemented by a mayor from PT, Partido dos Trabalhadores. It's very funny in Portuguese, not so much maybe in English, but Mayor Quaquá decided to implement what looked like an unconditional cash transfer in the city. And he did it with a local currency, and he started out the policy very targeted to very low-income populations, but since then has enlarged the scope. And it's actually now becoming a policy where average income earners in Maricá and low income earners actually are receiving an unconditional basic income, which is astounding, although it is in a local currency, but is astounding. So we had these sorts of things like in Maricá, established policy that has a research team that is conducting research there, or like what happened in Iran with the subsidy on cash transfers, or what happened in Macau, which is a wealth partaking scheme from casino revenues. These are policies that have been implemented in particular places. But then we also had basic income pilots, what happened in Namibia, for example, where you really had either randomized controlled trials or saturation studies. Something is not clear, we can clarify it afterwards, where everyone was trying to understand how a basic income could happen in practice. So if you wanted to implement it, how should we do it? So you decided to have a sample of people, you chose an entire village, and you attributed an unconditional cash grant to those people, and you surveyed the results for 2 years, or in Kenya for 12 years even. So you had these. And then we also had a third kind of sample cluster of case studies that were targeted and were focused on very particular things. Take what happened in Finland. It was called basic income, but it was only targeted to long-term unemployed people, and it was unconditional, but it was a lot of focus on trying to see whether people found work easier and faster than other people who were also long-term unemployed but were receiving money with activation policies. So conditional policies. They received money, but they had to prove employment or had to prove training. So whereas in the beginning we're very excited, we continue to be excited, but we're very excited, we realized the sample was very distinct. These policies, small-scale experiments, they were pilots. And so we found out that, okay, it might be very different, and to compare results from these three clusters of case studies. And it might be important to distinguish them or not when we are talking about our case studies. But as Roberto was saying, we decided to say, okay, they are different, the distinction is relevant, we will keep it in mind, and in the book, if you read it, we do make that distinction when it is clear, but let's try to move along and explore the findings and the context to see we can find similarities nonetheless. So we start out with this question in part 1 and start very skeptical about what we are doing. And they are different not only in particular goal of what they are doing and what happens in the context where they are implemented, but they are also very different in terms of methodologies. So as I was saying, in some of the pilots or some of the small-scale experiments, you might have what's usually called a saturation study, where you choose a particular city, a particular village, a particular country that hasn't happened, maybe sometimes it will happen, and you give everyone the cash transfer and you try to see the results. Or, what is sometimes most common in social sciences experiments, you try to do a randomized control trial, where you have two groups, sometimes 3, but you have 2 groups, which is a control group and a treatment group. The treatment group is the one who receives the unconditional cash grant, receives the treatment, whereas the control group is the one who receives nothing, and is very similar to the treatment group, so it allows you to compare whether results are attributed to the cash grant that you gave them. And then you had a third group, namely policies, where the methodology was kind of constrained. If the policy has been implemented for quite a while, you can not do a randomized control trial. You cannot say, you've received the policy for a while, now let's take the money because we want to do a research. No, you had to do surveys, or you had to try to get information from before the experiment to see whether you could find results. So it was really different from these clusters to really understand the methodologies that they were implementing and to find commonalities. Meaning that, again, when we are talking about basic income experiments, we had a range and a diverse set of methodologies that are implemented, and also of goals like you have here. In pilots you might find, like in Namibia, that the goal was to see how basic income could work in Namibia. So they really wanted to know how they could implement a basic income afterwards. Whereas, for example, in particular in Finland, it was argued that was the case, but not so much. But in Kenya, for example, it's not so much how basic income can work, the one from Give Directly. It's more, what are the broad impacts? What do we really assess with the basic income? Do people get happier? Do people invest more money? Do people become entrepreneurs? And then the third, like what happened in the Netherlands, the Utrecht experiment, but in Barcelona, it also was the case. They are not so much concerned about how a basic income could work or what are the particular aspects of basic income. They are rather trying to compare basic income with conditional policies. So they want to know, when we are talking about long-term unemployed people, whether a basic income fares better in labor market activation or social inclusion mechanisms than existing activation policies. So this makes for, again, comparison quite tough. And I'm not trying to be overly pessimistic. In the end, I think you'll realize that we thought we could compare them in some way. But it makes a comparison very difficult because they are so distinct and because they also have very different motivations. If you're talking about how basic income could work, you might have more an advocacy or political mindset. You want to know how afterwards you can go ahead and implement it at a countrywide level or a citywide level. Whereas if you're really focused about results, you might be advocate driven. If you're an activist, you want to know results so that you can then say, yes, people, everyone's going to continue working, or everyone's going to be happier, let's go implement it. Or because you want to do a paper about basic income and you want to know the results on labor market activation. But again, this makes for comparison sometimes tough. But we end up one of the first chapters of the book saying that it's true that they are different, as I was telling you, not only different in terms of the context, but different in terms of methodologies and goals. They are also different in terms of design of the policy. As Roberto was saying, a lot of them are not universal, like you had in Finland, where it was targeted at long-term unemployed, or like what you have in some places in the US where you are targeting black mothers, for example. Some of them were not individual. Actually, most of our case studies were individual. I think only the policy in Maricá was not individual, was targeted at a household level still, although they are moving towards individual. Most of them are not an amount that is enough to live a life with dignity, as is usually said in the true definition of basic income. They are at a lower level that allows you for pay for some needs, but not much more than that. That's why in the US, they call it guaranteed income instead of basic income. But we argue in the book that despite their differences, they are all unconditional. That's why Roberto was saying that it's, and I agree, it's at the heart of the definition of basic income. All of these experiments, all of these policies are obligations-free, which means that they can tell us a little bit about what it would be to implement a cash transfer that is obligations-free. So, again, limited comparability. We have to keep in mind the differences, limited scalability, in the sense that if it's difficult to compare, it might be difficult also to scale results and say, if in one experiment we find out that people do not work, it means that if we implement a UBI everywhere else, people will continue working or will not work. So it's difficult to do this if experiments are so distinct and have a context that's so different. And finally, in part one, after we argue that there's limited comparability and limited scalability, we look into the results. And we try to see, okay, but based on some of these case studies, we do have a lot of data on experiments, and on basic income, or in unconditional cash transfers. And we do know that welfare and health benefits are quite positive. We also know that in some places there's increased autonomy for individuals, especially when it's an individual cash transfer. There's some inputs on economic activity, namely in experiments in the global south, like in Namibia, like in Kenya, some in India too. But we also know that we have gaps in understanding. That's what we try to argue. So for example, everyone says that with the basic income, people could invest more in their own education or can invest more in the education of their children. But actually, we found very little information based on reports, but based on our interviews too. And on labor market participation, it also seems to be not enough. Either not so much because people will continue to have their prejudice, that certainly is going to be the case, but also when we were discussing with our interviewees, there was not a concrete reply to will people stop working or not. It seems people continue working to some length, but you can always say that it's because the basic income that it's being attributed is very small, or because you didn't do a large-scale experiment to see the large-scale impacts in labor market demand and supply. So there's always arguments which are very sound to say that we don't have enough information on labor market participation. And so this to tell you that in part one, where we surveyed the general cases that we had and the general questions we had from the interviews, we were trying to answer the question of what can be the role of basic income experiments, and we find out that they can provide some evidence, and we do have gaps in understanding, but they don't seem to be concrete on providing the evidence that we need most of the times. They are important to promoting the discussion and the debate. That certainly seems to be the case. But there's also the question of whether they're going to be detrimental to implementation or not. So we carry on these questions and these possibilities to part two. And I'm going to try to be brief so that we can have more time for the discussion. So in part two, we have three main chapters where we try to survey and to analyze some of what we say are new questions, in the sense of not being so much explored in the literature. So the first one is arguing on whether basic income experiments were, and policies, our case studies, were more driven by moral claims on, for example, in Namibia, our interviewees were telling us that they were a lot of focused on wanting to have a policy that could ensure that people had material security and that were able to fulfill better their lives than what they had currently. Or are they more instrumental, like it happened in Utrecht or like it happened in Barcelona, where you simply know that the system is not working and you want to change it to someone else, so you want to test a different system to see if it's a little bit better or not. And this seemed to be, at a first glance, connected with whether we had more research-oriented teams or more politically oriented teams. And the experiments were and the case studies were quite mixed. So in some you had a very important influence from politicians, like happened in Finland, like happened in Utrecht. In Utrecht, actually, we interviewed someone from the local municipality, or what happened in Barcelona. Whereas others, you had a strong presence of researchers, like happens with Give Directly, what happened in India too. So researchers were very preponderant and relevant in how the experiment took place. And we were wondering if researchers were the one driving the experiment, was this going to be different, looking at the methodology and looking at the goal. And what we find is that actually there's a mix. All experiments seem to have a mix on the moral reasons to implement it, and if we want to say the more instrumental, the particular ones that they take place. And they are all political instruments to a sense. So even if you have an experiment that is very focused on research, very oriented to have outcomes that are research sound and they try to be untempered, actually then the framing of the experiment, or how media takes up the experiment afterwards, or how politicians take the experiment afterwards, they frame it in a different way and it becomes a political instrument. And we saw that across the board. We saw that in Finland, in the case that Roberto was telling about. Minho told us how in the beginning they were really focused on having a very good research and a very good methodology. But then in the middle of the experiment, the government decided to implement a new activation policy and made it much tougher for people who were under the control group to get employment, made it much tougher and forced people in the control group to get employment, which tempered the results, because if you tamper with the treatment group or the control group during an experiment, you're going to tamper with the final results of the experiment. So what seemed to be a very sound research methodology ended up being very tampered with because of the influence of the government in the case. We saw it in Ontario too. In the beginning, it was actually politically motivated, but they had a very strong research team. The experiment started out in the first year, but then the government changed, and the new party decided that they didn't want to have the experiment, despite of all the regulations, the liability of having people receiving money for 1 year, and the experiment was shut down afterwards. So across our case studies, whether they were really political or they were very research-oriented, we found out that political tampering or the way the political context influences experiments makes these kinds of UBI experiments really political instruments. We also surveyed results, and when we say in the second part is that we have gaps in understanding, as we told you in the first part, but we also have a lot of data that came out from the case studies that hasn't received as much attention as it could maybe. And these were three important ones. Identity and power relations. For example, in the experiments in Madhya Pradesh in India, Sarat Davala told us how a UBI was important to change the power relations within families. He told a very interesting case. So the experiment was universal in Madhya Pradesh. Everyone could join, but it was voluntary. So people could decide whether they wanted it or not. And most people said, yes, sure, if it's going to receive money, we want to do it, we would like to be part of the experiment. But richer families were very skeptical. So they were saying they didn't want it to receive it because they feared they could survey what they had and the government could take out their money, or the ONGs that were involved could take out the money, so they didn't want it to join. Then the experiment not only gave a card, so ATM card, a money card for everyone, to receive the basic income, but it also gave some financial lessons in the middle of the village. And so the women from these richer households realized that they could receive their own card if their family was part of the experiment. And so they tried to push their husbands and went into the responsibles saying, no, we do really want to make part because we're going to be able to have some independence because we're going to receive our own money. So then some were able to join because they pressured their husbands and luckily were successful and were able to join the experiment. So this to say that the fact that it's an individual cash grant can actually change the power relations within the village and within the households that receive a basic income. And this also, like in empowering women, it also happened more in the global south. We have little less evidence of that happening in Western countries, experiments in Western countries. There was also some information on community empowerment. In Namibia, for example, Dirk Hartman told us that in the end of the experiment, people and the communities were feeling in Otiveiro were feeling quite empowered because of the money they had received. And so they demanded to their politicians, they demanded more accountability to what was happening in the village, but also they wanted to demand the UBI. So they really protested, and it was a poor village before the experiment, and they protested arguing that they would like to have more UBI and more times with UBI instead of finishing the experiment there. So there was an empowerment and people were together trying to argue for something that was beneficial for their community. And finally, trust, which I also find is interesting and maybe not so much focused, and it was in Finland. So Minho was telling us how labor market participation was super focused, was very discussed. Well-being and happiness was also discussed as a secondary result, but not so much was discussed about increased institutional trust. So it seems that people that received an unconditional cash grant actually trusted more their local institutions and their national institutions than those that were receiving a conditional cash grant. Unfortunately, they did not pursue this more to try to see why this was the case, but it was an interesting finding that for us seemed to deserve a little bit more attention. So just to tell you that this was trying to follow the line of part 2. So we start out by discussing the moral and instrumental claims of experiments. We go into results that haven't been so much analyzed. And then we try to, because we argue that experiments are political tools, we try to argue if they are political tools, how can we discuss it as such? And assuming experiments as political tools means assuming that they can be tampered with by political processes, but also that they can be subject to manipulation and especially to populism. So for example, in India, they now had the experiments in Madhya Pradesh, but also in other villages. And Sarat Davala was telling us that the concept of unconditionality really stuck to the mind of a lot of people. And so now particular parties are using unconditional cash grants as a buzzword to say, we are going to implement an unconditional cash grant. And there was one for rural farmers and targeted for other populations. So it can actually become an electoralist and populist policy because you are giving money to people. When we talked with the people in Brazil, they were also saying how they weren't sure where the idea of an unconditional cash grant in the local currency came to Mayor Kwakwa, although the basic income movement in Brazil is strong and it has some years with Suplicy. But nonetheless, they kind of figured it out. It could be subject to populism, because especially once you implement some sort of unconditional policy, it's tough to tell people that you're not going to give them money afterwards. You gave them for the last 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. Are you really going to be the politician who's not going to give it? No. Maybe if you want to win elections, you're going to be the politician who's going to increase the value of the basic income. So it really can be subject to populism and manipulation. And in this particular chapter, we also focus on if it's a political tool. Should we be using it to lobby? Should we use experiments and results and claim for experiments to lobby for an unconditional basic income? Or should we lobby for an experiment? And in this final part of the book that goes into our conclusion, we discuss whether experiments are better to promote the debate and to argue for basic income, or should we push for a basic income as a policy, especially now after COVID, instead of continue arguing for experiments? And I think this can be a good debate. Some of you might be activists, and this can be a good debate to discuss it. So to close, so how do we try to discuss it? So we say that basic income experiments are relevant, and we try to go into the main justifications. And we start off saying, can we justify it because we need more data? So is the justification of basic income experiments the fact that we need to know more about results of basic income? And we say, yes, we still need empirical data, and we need it for advocacy. So we need to tell people that people will continue working, maybe if they work a bit less, or we need to tell people that people will feel less anxious, will feel less stressed, will feel happier, will trust more their citizens and local institutions, imagine. And also for some ethical debates. As Roberto was saying, we are not going to settle ethical debates with basic income experiments, but we can contribute to particular ethical debates by bringing in new information from experiments. For example, if we know that a basic income increases trust in institutions, maybe on the ethical debate on reciprocity, which is the one that I'm most concerned with, might be relevant to know how institutional trust relates to the norm of reciprocity in a given political community. However, we also say it's very tough to generalize. If experiments are very different, come from very different contexts, we can use information, but we need to be careful. We cannot use a particular result to settle the debate. We also say that stakeholders are key. They are key not necessarily because we want to get rid of them. So there were some claims to have only laboratory experiments and to focus only on that instead of having social sciences experiments, because they occur in a sort of vacuum, and so it's easier to have untempered results, and so no one's going to argue against them. We say that's not the case. Even lab experiments are going to be subjected to political framing and to political debates afterwards, and can be subjected to manipulation. And so what we say is that we should have context-meaningful experiments. And what does this mean? It means that probably we need to, and we side with Witherspoon, it means that we need to know what are the particular agendas of the context. So if in Finland the concern was about whether people will work or not, we should have integrated that much more into the experiment. We should have known what people were concerned about. Was it working hours? Was whether women worked and men did not work? Was the type of work that people were doing? And should try to get that information more into the experiment and communicate it more afterwards. And then finally, and this I'm going to leave to the debate, finally we talked about COVID-19. Unfortunately, we couldn't move past it. And we tried to discuss whether COVID-19 was important to leapfrog the debate or not, if it was important to leapfrog the debate in favor of experiments or in favor of UBIs. And in the end, we simply say experiments are indeed important as research and as political tools, but they need to keep in mind their limitations and the important problems that they are facing, which means that they should maybe incorporate much more their limitations in the design, in how they frame and communicate the results. And we end up with 7 principles, which are quite, I think, straightforward, but sometimes are not so taken into account when experiments take place, which are these ones. So the first, straightforward, experiments should be designed to collect robust empirical data. Even policy should do that. The second, not so much taken into account, we should have sound ethical designs. And that sometimes might mean that an experiment is not the best avenue to go. If we have important ethical downsides in an experiment, maybe we should try something else. The third, which also usually does not happen, we should engage a broad set of stakeholders. In the US, for example, in Stockton, they engaged the community where the experiment was going to take place and asked them which results did they wanted to see communicated. If they said, we don't want anything to be communicated, we really want our privacy to be kept, at least the researchers, they told us they were going to vouch for it. Actually, people said, publish everything, including where we are spending the money, we have nothing to hide, and we really want the information all out there. But they engaged the people, the communities, the politicians, the researchers in the process. We also say that data should be relevant for local stakeholders, so don't focus the research on only researchers or only international media. Again, if people are concerned about consumption patterns, then it's important to talk about consumption patterns in the way that local people will understand the experiment. Take a look at communication, which sometimes we don't, and we should, otherwise it might happen what happened in Finland, where an experiment that was successful ends up being framed as unsuccessful simply because of how it was framed. Engaged with the normative debates. So from our interviews, it was clear we shouldn't shy away from the debates on contributive ethics, reciprocity, or paternalism. Engage with them and incorporate them in the experiments. And then 7, maybe one of the most controversial points, actually it was Jamie Cook from Scotland that told us, that is about the political window. He was arguing that now with COVID, for example, in Scotland, the political window for basic income is broad. So Nicola Sturgeon was saying, which is the Prime Minister, saying that she's in favor of basic income. So he was saying, if they are in favor of basic income, do not argue for an experiment. Argue for basic income. Let's not do an experiment if they want to roll out a basic income. And sometimes we are so focused on having research and having data and trying out everything that we miss out the idea of maybe some of us are activists. So if basic income could be implemented, let's go for it, and then we'll assess the results afterwards. So this case of the political window seemed to be also an important point to keep in mind. Sorry if I went a little bit overboard, and thank you very much.